Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Sabbat Worlds Crusade, where things have at least gone from outright catastrophic to merely desperate for Warmaster Macorths' inherited crusade. After having severely overestimated the amount of time it would take the enemy to find a new leader, the Warmaster's crazed dash towards the Cabal's system came to a screeching halt when he ran headfirst into the fortress world, and indeed fortress system, of Morland and its surrounding strongholds. The Imperial Crusade had found itself bashed against an anvil, as a part of the new Chaos Archon's grand scheme, as Gaur had drawn the Imperials in, and was even now beginning to close the jaws of an enormous system-wide trap around the Crusade's neck. In a series of desperate dispatches in the late days of 771 and now the beginning of 772, Warmaster Macorths had dispatched his generals to hold the beast's jaws open. This titanic task would fall to 5 men, the generals Uriens, Vanvoits and Frederick, as well as Lord Militants Sibon and Deliani. They were dispatched to secure several key worlds, to first and foremost ensure that the Crusade would be able to rely upon immediate Promethium supplies so as to not be starved of this crucial liquid. The worlds of Gigar, Miridon, Aondrift Nova, and Aximander were targeted for their deep liquid Promethium wells. If these could be grabbed and held, it would provide the Imperium with an immediate supply of Promethium to fuel its war machine, without having to rely upon the now ever more fraught supply lines. The world of Tansina IV, Ariadne, and Urdesh, foremost amongst them, would be targeted for their already pre-existing mass stockpiles of fuel, and Urdesh as well as a moral victory. We were about to enter into the darkest years of the Imperial Crusade, and it was Warmaster Macorths' hope that a quick push towards Urdesh, and perhaps even a rapid liberation, would serve to lift the Imperium's spirit. Unfortunately, Urdesh would prove a far tougher nut to crack than originally estimated, and would remain contended for many, many years. And finally, the planets of Rydol and Phantine, as we covered the last 2 videos, were targeted for their vapor mills. These operations were often somewhat improvised, as the commanders in questions were ordered to gather whatever men they could from whatever sources they could without weakening Macorths' drive into the Cabal's system, as he was still hoping for a quick breakthrough that would see the back of the Chaos forces shattered before the jaws could close. This hope, however, was fading by the day, and the temporary operations in the rearward lines carried out by the 2nd and 3rd lines of Imperial Guard and Imperial Navy defenses started looking more and more like permanent front lines. Fortunately for the Imperium, Macorths' eye for personnel did not fail him here, and the commanders that he had selected for the task at hand proved more than capable, with all of the designated objectives besides the world of Ariadne being achieved. Uriens was the general in charge of the assault on Ariadne, but he had simply been unable to secure adequate forces to take on what was a far larger than expected blood-packed presence. General Uriens had in essence run into the same problem that Vanvoits had, but whereas Voits had a rabbit in his hat by the name of Ibrahim Gaunt, Uriens did not manage to replicate Vanvoits' successes. Still, Ariadne was not a Promethium-producing world, it was merely a major world with a huge stockpile, and thus the loss was immediately a bit more of a pinch, but in long terms it would not matter too much, and with the majority of the objectives secured, Macorths could finally take a breath. The complete annihilation of the Imperial Crusade had passed from a virtual certainty to a mere possibility. The problem of the new front lines, however, remained. It was very clear by now that whilst the enemy's massed counterattack had not succeeded in its objective of snipping off the Imperium's head here, there were still a lot more and a lot more effective enemy forces pushing in against the salient than Macorths could afford to ignore. And so what began as a temporary reorganization would now become a permanent one, with Macorths, much to the absolute horror of all of his commanders, began a full-scale mass reorganization of the entire Crusade, top to bottom, splitting it into 9 armies. The first army would of course remain under Warmaster Macorths and would continue their assault against the Cabal system in an effort to break through the fortress world of Morland. In this effort he would be assisted by the 3rd and 4th armies under the command of Lord Militant Sibon and General Uriens. These 3 armies would form the spearhead of the Crusade, and would thus be afforded the majority of the heavy assets: tanks, super heavies, titans, and space marines, along with the majority of the elite regiments and the heavy assaulters, every single one of which was going to be required if there was to be any hope of cracking Morland, as it was a fortress world that more than deserved the name. Up until mid-772, the Imperial Crusade had not even managed to actually land on the planet itself. They were still working their way through the enormous minefield surrounding the planet. Billions upon billions of hunter-killer mines were scattered in enormous shoal patterns throughout the system and near all of the stable warp translation routes. Any move forward without literally weeks, if not months, of scouting would be utterly suicidal. Meanwhile, the Chaos fleets could themselves operate with impunity, as they knew exactly where every single device was, and could move through constantly shifting lanes in the minefield to strike out against the Imperial invaders. Meanwhile, these paths that changed every 48 hours were all but invisible to the Imperium, as it is really goddamn difficult to find a piece of inert ordnance drifting through the void, with nothing more than minuscule maneuvering thrusters to give away its position. Basically reducing the entirety of the Imperial fleet, with all of their augers and fancy gadgets, to looking out the window. Now, an enhanced look out the window with optics, obviously, and all manners of cogitator-assisted analysis patterns, but still, the Imperium was, well, looking through binoculars to discover mines, and then begin to slowly work out an algorithmic understanding of how the mines moved, what paths could potentially be navigated, and what paths would have to be cleared by mine-clearing vessels, who would of course in turn need to be protected against constant Verhedwak raiders. In fact, the ravagers of these fast-moving small light ships, frigates or light cruisers, were one of the greatest difficulties in penetrating the system, as huge parts of the Imperial Navy escort had to simply sit back as nursemaids over the titanic transports carrying the Imperial Guardsmen towards their eventual destination of Morland. A planet they wouldn't actually even reach for quite some time yet, but when they did, nothing was going to get any easier, as Morland was not just a heavily fortified planet, it had been a fortress world for, well, as far as Imperial history stretched. there were signs that the earliest fortifications on the planet, which covered pretty much damn near the entire thing, mind you, dated back to the 4th millennium. In an age so long gone now that it has been forgotten about 50 times over, somebody happened upon Morland and decided that it needed to be fortified to every extent imaginable. Thousands of citadels were constructed across its surface, each dominating the terrain around it, creating a vast planetary interlocking defense grid, now further enhanced with anti-orbital weaponry. And in between these countless citadels ran earthworks, fortified bunker lines, and trenches. What would have been principal fortifications on any other world, the kind of stuff you'd built up around a major capital city, were mere provincial defences on Morland. And due to its position, the Imperium had obviously built it up after its discovery as a bulwark against chaos. Those Imperial citizens that had conquered the Sabbat Worlds long ago had obviously seen it as an excellent position from which to organize defenses against the Chaos forces in the sanguinary worlds, and they had added to the already significant defenses with weapons of their own, guns, artillery batteries, huge depots of weapons and ammunition, and orbital defense weapons as well, most of which had been seized largely intact by the Chaos forces under Archon Nadzibar when he conquered the Sabbat Worlds, the very cause why this crusade was embarked upon now more than 17 years ago. It would take every ounce of the Warmaster's focus, of his tactical and strategic brilliance, along with the full force of 3 entire Imperial armies, to even begin to hope to reduce these defenses. And that was exactly what Gaur was counting on. The Gaur's shield, his anvil in the form of both Morland and the Cabal worlds in general, had succeeded in their initial objective of halting the Imperial Crusade, but denied his immediate sweeping victory via flank attacks. The Gaur now moved on to the next part of his plan: a massed counterattack. The Warmaster swiftly became aware through Imperial intelligence that huge Vehedwak and Chaos fleet forces were gathering in the Karkaradon cluster. This grouping of systems would be the operational base from which the Gaur would launch an enormous counter-thrust straight in against the Imperium's spear tip, meeting the brunt of the Imperium's forces in a titanic collision of troops. Now, this might seem over-optimistic on behalf of the Archon, because surely this kind of a decisive conflict was why he had become Archon in the first place, after his predecessor, Nadzibar, had sought the exact same kind of decisive blow against Slado. The difference now, at least as far as Gaur was concerned and hoped, was that this was not an Imperial trap, it was a Chaos one. The majority of the Imperium's forces would be grinding up against worlds prepared for them by every art of defensive measurement. Furthermore, these forces would be weakened by attacks upon their flanks and restrictions upon their supply lines. Finally, Gaur launched his most trusted lieutenants, including Anakwana Sek and Innocenti, upon the Crusade flanks, both in an effort to strangle aforementioned supplies, to try and close the trap if still possible, and to spread terror amongst the Imperial forces. This was almost certainly an operation that Anakwana Sek had brought to the Gaur's attention, as he was the key lieutenant executing the tactic. They would spread words of Imperial worlds being conquered back to the rear lines. They would ensure that surviving groups of refugees would be able to escape the Chaos Cordon, to bring tales of woe and destruction to the Crusade forces. They would even make sure that communications with worlds under assault would remain open. Simply so that all those upon the other conquered Imperial worlds would hear the screams of those upon whom Chaos was now wreaking its revenge. With all of these advantages stacked in the Gaur's favor, he presumed that when he did meet the Imperials in a decisive struggle, they would already be demoralized, starving, and undermanned. And as Macorths continued his push into the Cabal worlds, he was beginning to think that the Gaur might very well be right. Macorths grew more and more closed off, spending weeks at a time planning out the move of each army in intricate detail, working out every strategic option, every tactical possibility, every move and every counter-move. And the news were not good. At the end of the day, he concluded that his entire strategy now rested on a coin toss. He had two options. Either he continued his drive into the Cabal worlds, hoping to break through at Morland, hoping yet again to crush the back of the Chaos forces and interrupt the Gaur's preparations in the Carcharodon clusters, in essence attempting a second Balhat, or he backed off the Cabal system, realizing that he could not break through it, and thus instead focused his forces on prying open the Gaur's jaws closing around him. After which, having hopefully secured his flanks, he could then resist the Chaos counterattack, which would then be heading straight down his gullet. Neither option looked particularly good. In fact, both options seemed as if they could easily end in the entire Crusade's destruction. If he pulled back and focused on the flanks, then the Gaur's main strength force would slash right through his center, annihilating him as surely as any circumnavigation. If he continued to focus on the Cabal worlds, the jaws of the beast might finally snap shut around his neck, decapitating the Crusade and yet again ending with its wholesale annihilation. A fanciful tale emerged quite popularly at the time, the veracity of which is probably in question, where apparently Macorths invited Lord Militant Sibon to dinner one day, and he presented him with 2 cups, completely identical, filled with the same deep red liquid. And he told the Lord Militant, one is a potion, one is a poison. Choose. And when Sibon asked how he could possibly tell, Macorths picked up a cup, drank from it, and simply said, by taking one up and tasting it. Perhaps not an encouraging answer, but a truthful one, as Macorths would eventually decide to entrust his rear to his chosen generals and instead continue to push in to the Cabal salient. We'd then have the rest of his new 9 armies. The 5th army would be awarded to General Lucium. They would be tasked with protecting the rear guard of the Warmaster's 3 main armies, in case Urlok Gaur attempted another decapitating maneuver, but on a smaller scale. And considering he had complete free reign of the Crusade's flanks, that was a significant concern. Significant enough to dedicate the entire army to it. Then, the 6th Army, along with the 8th Army under Chapter Master Vigum and General Kelso, would be directed towards the Khan group, in which they would busy themselves with opposing Magister Innocenti, one of the Gaur's leading warlock, and one of the favorites of the old Archon Nadzibar. General Blackwood and the Second Army would be tasked both with the prosecution of the offensive against Urdesh, and also by protecting Imperial resupply lines in the northern side of the salient around Urdesh. Lord Militant Hummel would be given the Ninth Army and dispatched to the world of Enothis, where a major Chaos attack was currently in the offing. It was hoped that the Imperial forces would arrive in time to preempt this build-up that was presumed to be led by Magister Anequanar Sek himself. If this could be blunted, then yet further air could be dragged into the Imperium's lung, as another one of the dangerous threats towards the salient itself would be headed off before it could even begin. And finally, Marshal Blackwood would take the Crusade's 7th Army and head back corewards to create another rearguard and reserve focused primarily on holding the Cabal salient open, ensuring that the ease of supplies would continue through Belshir Binary and Alpha Madrigal. These reorganizational measures still left the Crusade massively overstretched, but at the very least now there was a method to the madness. Commanders had been given areas of responsibility, and solid Imperial Guard reserves had been dedicated both to the defense of this large salient and to the prosecution of further offensive objectives out of it. And hopefully, with further offensive successes, the situation could begin to properly stabilize. Even though in reality, the main play for stability right now was a breakthrough at Morland, before the enemy's reserves could fully mobilize and smash into the Warmaster's 3 frontal armies. It was going to be a tall order to do so. It was going to be a tall order merely just to keep the salient open at this rate, and the Warmaster's position was yet again under attack, as there were now plenty of people whispering that old Slado would never have put them in this position. And hey, they were probably right. But on the other hand, most of these people had just last year been praising Warmaster Macorth's visionary leadership. His rush towards the horizon had seemed to be on the very verge of securing absolute victory, and now that that had turned out to all be based on a flawed premise, they were quick to start criticizing the man. And fair enough. He had certainly walked into a trap, but he was now also focused 100% on getting himself back out of it. Even though, as the year 773 began to move towards an end, it seemed as if the only thing that could save the Imperial Crusade in the Sabbat Worlds was a miracle. Or maybe 2. The foundation of which we will begin to build on X Cardinal in the next episode, as now that we've had a moment to look at the Crusade in total, it's time to focus back in on the Tarnith yet again, as they have a very, very big role to play in the miracle that may still save the Imperial Crusade. Until then, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.